Fab. Hi. Um, First of all, big thanks to Dr. Sam Hurst, of course, again, for allowing me to come along and talk to you all, and also just for creating this space where we can all talk about the books and other things that we love. It's we're really lucky to have it, actually. I'm really enjoying being a part of it. And thank you to you all for coming. And I'll do my best to make sure this is a worthwhile use of your time. So at the start of Agatha Christie's 450 from Paddington, a moving train draws parallel with another. A Scottish woman looks out of her window and sees a murder in the train carriage opposite. Now, Muriel Spark is one of the most successful Scottish literary talents of all time. Agatha Christie is the most popular crime novelist of all time, or, to put it another way, she had a talent for murder. The trains of their lives and works, can you see what I'm doing here, run more or less parallel with a few divergent stopping points, but with both contributing in meaningful and distinct ways to the Western cultural landscape of the 20th and the 21st centuries. So whilst Christie was mostly, but not entirely, operating within the crime thriller school, Spark's novels play with the genre in a more mercurial way. I will argue that both writers have been underestimated as lightweight by a literary culture that is laced with misogyny, as if it's kind of cyanide in the soup. Both writers' works run the gamut all the way from camp to cruel, and in doing so challenged reductive perceptions of domesticity and femininity. By comparing and contrasting their lives and their works, we can appreciate both writers' works more fully and hopefully convert more of you to being Spark fans. So it's true to say that biographical criticism can only take us so far, but these two authors' lives offer much to compare, as you can see on the screen. Spark resisted others' attempts to narrativize her life, so I can only assume she'd be absolutely furious about this slide. Christie, too, actually rejected several attempts to write her life story before eventually relenting and writing it herself. But she said, "If anybody writes about my life in the future, I'd rather they got their facts right." A quote which, if I didn't know any better, I would have said that was Spark talking. So Agatha Christie was born in 1890 in Devon. Spark was born in 1918, over 400 miles north of her in Edinburgh. Christie passed away in 76 and Spark exactly 30 years later in 2006. For both authors, there is staggeringly around half a century between the composition of their first and last novels, though in the productivity stakes, Christie tears strips off literally every other writer since the dawn of time, publishing at least one book a year in that time, whereas Spark averaged closer to one every 2 years, which is, lazy, frankly. Like the iconic protagonist of Spark's greatest novel, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, let us ask, when were their respective primes? So arguably Christie's was in the 30s, in which she published hits such as Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile. She put the difficulties of her first marriage breakdown behind her. This was the decade in which she met and married her second husband, and introduced Miss Marple in novel form to the world. Spark's prime was later in the 1960s, the decade in which she introduced Miss Brodie to the world, her spinster, quoting Blair, and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize for the first time, if not the last. But let's not forget that the juggernaut that was Christie was still writing up to and beyond the 60s herself. And in fact, just a very brief side note, you can hear me and my friend Dr. Mark Aldridge talking about Christie in the 1960s and how neglected that is and how important it is to see her as a meaningful contributor to the 60s culture, in our forthcoming podcast, The Swinging Christies, and you can follow us on social media at Christie_time. Quote, "You must be on the alert to recognize your prime at whatever time of your life it may occur," says Jean Brodie. And I like to think that Spark, her creator, was one to heed this advice. There is a familial basis for this affinity between Christie and Spark too. So Spark had a complex relationship with her son Robin, who she temporarily left in the care of a convent in what is now Zimbabwe during the Second World War, while he was sort of 5 or 6. Their discordant relationship culminated in a very public tabloid spat in the 90s over Robin's insistence that Muriel should self-identify as Jewish, despite her conversion to Catholicism. Says Martin Stallard, a Spark biographer. Some members of the press could never forgive her for being a free woman. They concentrated on her relationship with her son. It's worth noting that there are two very good reasons as to why as to why Muriel left Robin temporarily. One being the danger of the voyage in wartime, and the other being the complete embargo on transporting children at the time. Quoting Stannard again there. So similarly, many reported a sometimes difficult dynamic between Christie and her daughter Rosalind. It's telling that many narratives of Christie's disappearance and her world travels make specific reference to the act of this mother leaving her child behind. Similarly, many profiles of Robin Spark led with his, quote, abandonment for many years after the fact. I'm paraphrasing Lucy Worsley now, the most recent biographer of Christie. Would all this make Agatha that endlessly satisfying target, the bad mother? Of course not, for there is no such thing. But she never felt she had to throw herself into mothering. Some of her most thoughtfully depicted relationships in her books are those between mothers and daughters. I would posit that these publicized perceived failings from maternal figures may in part explain why our literary culture has struggled to fully embrace both writers. In Christie's case, this often manifests as gatekeeping between genre, her work, and literary. Spark, on the other hand, is broadly accepted by the literary kind of intelligentsia, but holds minimal cultural currency beyond that. Logically, it tracks that it is easier to dismiss the work if the writer is deemed to be an unworthy person. Alan Taylor, a friend of Sparks, wrote, "The popular image of her was someone who was something of a misanthrope." He elaborated on the Penguin Classics podcast, saying, people didn't seem to catch her character. They wrote about the cruelty she showed to her characters, but they don't understand what people from Edinburgh are like. Apologies to any Scots listening. Alan's opinion is not mine. Meanwhile, Christie is often regarded as a, quote, jolly and bucolic lady, as Alison Light so brilliantly put it. The truth, as we shall see in both cases, is far more complex. As with any 20th century biography, the world wars inevitably have interjected. So Spark, quote, was born on the first day of the second month of the last year of the First World War. By this time, Christie worked in a dispensary, and it was while, quote, it was while I was working there that I first conceived the idea of writing a detective story. Indeed, her first novel and many others make good use of her knowledge of poisons. Quote, that idea of yours about the bromides was a stroke of genius, if Christie does say so herself, in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Christie is sometimes accused of writing in a Never Never Land, but the First World War is foundational to her entire canon as the instigator that brings Hercule Poirot and his sidekick Captain Hastings together. Christie then returned to the dispensary in the Second World War. Meanwhile, Spark joined the British intelligence in 1944, working on, quote, black propaganda, which is misinformation transmitted over enemy lines to undermine their ideology. As with Christie, the themes of this war work became integral to Spark's writing. She once charmingly described her collected novels as a pack of lies. Indeed, one can trace many of Spark's preoccupations back to this theme, including her metatextual, metaphysical manipulations of narrative perspective, her fight with Robin, and her near allergic reaction to biographies. Fascinatingly, Christie mentions that she was also, quote, asked if she would like to do propaganda work in her autobiography by none other than Graham Greene, the writer who would later become Spark's pen pal. Christie declined this offer, but it's further evidence of how Spark and Christie are kind of unknowingly occupying the same space at the same time. Once you start looking, these comparisons are almost too numerous to list. So I'll rattle through a couple now. But Spark's conversion to Catholicism looms almost as large in her canon as Christie's Catholic Hercule Poirot does in hers. Spark's first full-length novel, The Comforters, was birthed from an adult and spiritual point in Spark's life, which kind of heralded her conversion. By extension, we can view her whole body of work as arising from this epiphany. Both the Poirot canon and the Spark oeuvre include running themes of repentance, forgiveness, and justice. Poirot is often depicted as a father confessor type character, while Spark perpetually constructs these narratives with an ultimate higher power standing in judgment. Usually, let's be honest, it's herself. And perhaps the meticulous Poirot effectively followed Spark's advice. Quote, if you're going to do a thing, she's reported to have said, you should do it thoroughly. If you're going to be a Christian, you may as well be a Catholic. Both writers were occasionally inspired by current affairs, although neither is known for being a satirist or even comfortably openly political, which I think is reductive. As far back as at least her third novel, Murder on the Links, Christie was using real-life crimes to model her plots. Most notably from Spark, we have a book called Aiding and Abetting, a late novel, which is fantastic. It's her response to the disappearance of Lord Lucan. And the current Canongate edition calls that her, quote, mordant and witty satirical take on the true crime genre. And by the way, David Goldie makes the sly but accurate point that it's ironic that Spark is sensitive about people writing her life while displaying in this novel an apparent absence of concern for the feelings of Lady Lucan, which I believe is what we call literary shade. I mean, most importantly, the most important comparison between these two writers that I'm going to make today is that both writers' adaptations star the incomparable Maggie Smith, who won an Academy Award for her portrayal of Miss Jean Brodie and later appeared in the BBC adaptation of Memento Mori, that's this, as well as a much celebrated turn in the 1978 Death on the Nile. I made the point that Christie and Spark share a sense of camp, and I'd be doing a disservice, I think, to the concept of camp if I didn't mention Dame Maggie Smith. Ultimately, what links these two authors most comprehensively is not Maggie Smith, spoiler, it's the fact that they read each other. Thanks to John Curran, we know that Spark novels The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie and The Driver's Seat are listed in Christie in her notebooks. Specifically, Curran tells us that mention of The Driver's Seat comes alongside a short list of books all published in 1970, and that it interrupts the notes for Nemesis. The reference to Brodie, meanwhile, has 2 pluses marked beside it and is struck through. It's unclear what exactly this means. Could be read, could be loved, could be will use for future inspiration. I would argue that she does. More on that later. And thanks to Dr. Jamie Berntal, we know that Christie even requested complimentary copies of Spark's books. Indeed, when I was at Greenway, Christie's former holiday home, I spotted this on the slide here, published after Christie's death. We can deduce from this that a predisposition for Spark's books was passed down to Rosalind, her daughter. I enjoy Muriel Spark very much, Christie had told the London Sunday Times. Credit to Mark Aldridge for uncovering this interview. She's always so original, she said. And we know from Janet Morgan that Christie saw the play version of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie in London in 1966. Sorry. Characteristically, when Christie mentions Spark, she speaks with sincerity. When Spark refers to Christie, it's in the form of kind of witty asides. So, for example, there's a lot of people who think they can take my books and analyze me from them. On that principle, Agatha Christie would be a serial killer. When Spark was burgled, she pondered, we have various theories worthy of Agatha Christie, but so far no results. Note the admiration implicit in the word worthy there. But one of the reasons why both writers are sometimes underestimated, I would argue, is their prose style. Spark's economy of artistic means has undoubtedly prejudiced critics who automatically equate length with depth, writes Alan Bold. And similar has been said about Christie by peers such as Edmund Wilson and P.D. James. Spark taking a course in précis writing is wittily put by A.L. Kennedy as like a hawk taking flying lessons. Even wittier is Spark herself describing the protracted length of a James Joyce novel, calling it rude. She's right. In her autobiography, Christie declares, "I think myself that the right length for a detective story is 50,000 words. The totemic Brodie by Muriel Spark runs at just 40,000. Christie actually situates her prose in contrast to authors like Spark. Quote, "When you begin to write, you are usually in the throes of admiration for some writer, and whether you will or no, you cannot help but copy their style. If I could write like Elizabeth Bowen, Muriel Spark, or Graham Greene, I should jump to high heaven with delight, but I know that I can't. I have learned that I am me." We should take this with a pinch of salt because here is Christie's trademark self-deprecation. As in many ways, Spark's writing is more like hers than she claims, sharing a preference for cruelty, for camp, for upfront characterization, and for declarative sentences that evoke no-nonsense plain speaking. Thank you very much. Now, onto the case study. In the bookshelves, Spark is shelved away from Christie in the fiction section, but I would argue that 3 of Spark's novels in particular have grounds to be reshelved in crime, and they are Memento Mori, The Driver's Seat, and Not to Disturb. Take a self-enclosed community of writers, schoolgirls, nuns, rich people, etc., toss in a bombshell like murder, suicide, betrayal that will ricochet dangerously across this little world. That's Spark's formula, according to Michiko Kakutani's review of Aiding and Abetting, quoted in James Bailey, but it could also be read as a formula for crime novels generally and for Christie novels specifically. "It's a why done it," Lise, the main character of The Driver's Seat, announces. She's talking about the garishly covered book that she is reading at the time, but she could just as well be talking about the book in which she stars. In fact, Bailey points out that Lise is garishly covered too, as the novel opens with a scene of Lise in search of a kind of gaudy outfit that is crucially not stain resistant. The Driver's Seat, for those of you who haven't read it, I would recommend, although trigger warning, it's dark. The Driver's Seat is the story of a woman who is looking for the right man to murder her. It has been observed that Lisa's arc is a kind of parody of an Austenite romance novel, a parody of of looking for a man to marry her, and a plea that I made this morning as well. If anybody knows where that reading originates from or comes across it in their reading, please do let me know, because it is not my idea, but it's a fantastic one, and I read it years ago, and I want to find that passage again. But I would argue that more than that, The Driver's Seat is a response to whodunit. It's a why done it, Lise tells us herself. John Lanchester, in his foreword for The Driver's Seat, comments that in other works, the near jaunty tone could be at odds with its jet black content. In Spark World, they go together like murderer and victim. Murderer and victim are, of course, the 2 poles of Christie's fictional sphere. Then the novel published afterwards serves to immediately perpetuate Spark's thesis of kind of upturning the whodunit, and that's Not to Disturb, which is set across a single stormy night in a manor house in which a group of servants led by the enigmatic Lister enact their plan to murder their masters. And then there's Memento Mori, Spark's earlier treatise on the genre, which is about a circle of elderly London residents who are plagued by an anonymous caller who rings up to say to them simply, "Remember, you must die," which is, of course, a translation of the Latin title. A novel of mostly elderly cast trying and failing to get a grip on what exactly the mystery is that surrounds them could well summarize Christie's By the Pricking of My Thumbs, Elephants Can Remember, or Postern of Fate. So far, so Christie. This is until handbrake turn, the solution to Memento Mori is proposed. Considering the evidence, I think the caller is death itself. We as readers are invited both to consider this the logical answer to the mystery, but also to boggle at it. Christie would never. Of course, all of Christie and all murder mysteries by their nature must involve death as at least a subtext. But here Spark goes one better. Death is the text. At one point, a character in the novel says, quote, "This graveyard is a kind of evidence that other people exist." Memento Mori is one of these books for which Spark is labelled cruel, but this to me makes it among her most humane. Whereas Memento Mori begins as a classic mystery before taking this sudden turn, the driver's seat and Not to Disturb scream their deviance from the first line. Spark allows us whodunit hungry readers morsels such as the Ziploc bag that Lise, the main character in the driver's seat, carries, is a literal evidence bag of pre-curated clues, including it has within it the murder weapon to which she wants to succumb. In Not to Disturb, instead of the police taking statements, we see the servants preparing their statements as exclusives that they're going to sell to the press, exposing their motivation up front. They even have grand plans for serialization and a film adaptation. Everything that usually appears spontaneous has been meticulously thought through, down to how much sleep they're going to get and therefore how alert they will be when the police arrive, as if the narrative is kind of seeing the crime tropes before they even have chance to manifest and play out. In Memento Mori, these genre components are mostly rattled through in the denouement, murder and motives, down to the fact that you can feel Spark's refusal to fit her story neatly into this genre box and tie all the loose ends up, down to the fact that one character leaves behind a bewildering array of 22 contradictory wills. Complete side note, but Spark would go on to write exactly 22 novels. Coincidence? I'll leave you to ponder. You're coming with me, Lise says to a potential murderer. In the driver's seat, Lisa's defiant perversion of this normal victim narrative is so hyperbolic as to be amusing and appalling. As per Bailey, Lise has come to make herself strange and inscrutable, transforming her legible life into a mystery without an apparent solution, end quote. It's precisely what a Christie culprit does, marring and muddying their tracks, with Spark here transferring this action from culprit to victim, and in doing so challenging that binary. The driver's seat actually opens with what the All About Agatha Christie podcast, shout out to them, go listen if you haven't, would categorize as a costuming clue. The reader is led to believe in no uncertain terms that Lise has chosen a stainable and garish outfit for her trip, both so that she, quote, lays a trail in terms of eyewitnesses remembering her, and in an attempt to control the aesthetics of her soon-to-be lifeless body. This has many precedents in Christie, perhaps most notably in the short story The Plymouth Express from 1923. In this story, the way Flossie Carrington was dressed, quote, in a white fox fur toque with a white spotted veil and a blue frieze coat and skirt, the shade of blue they call electric, is deliberately standout. I'll give you a second just to picture that stunning outfit. Rather striking, says Poirot, slightly barbed. Poirot's hunch turns out to be completely correct. Quote, it was the maid's insistence on those clothes that her mistress was wearing that first struck me. Why was she so anxious that our attention should be directed to them? Now, if, after Bristol, anyone saw a lady in a bright blue coat and skirt and a fur toque, he will be quite ready to swear he had seen Mrs. Carrington. Like the driver's seat, but unlike Christie's prose, Not to Disturb is written mostly in the present tense. But crucially, Lister encourages us not to split hairs between the past, present, and future tenses. For him, it's immaterial, because though temporally the Baron is yet to die, for him, the Baron is already dead. Spark and Lister have decided to kill the Baron, so it may as well have already happened. They haunt the house, says Lister of the Baron and their other victims, like insubstantial bodies. This beautiful Gothic image of victim as apparition helps convert the text into a liminal space in which time is arbitrary. Or is it being obfuscated? Another of Christie's favourite narrative tricks from the likes of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. With this time trickery, Not to Disturb is doing precisely what Christie is doing in novels like Towards Zero, specifically refocusing and recalibrating the time frame through which we view the crime and posing the question, what if we started earlier? The crime may as standard happen in chapters 1 or 2, but the plans have been laid long before. The divinity of the plotting in Not to Disturb, the lightning bolt effect of the crime, is explicitly Gothic, which is, of course, another genre box that Spark rummages in, but Christie does too. All in all, if Christie was an admirer of Spark's style, then Spark, I would argue, is influenced by Christie's plots. A Spark novel is often a Christie novel, kind of half remembered and remixed, which, given how many of Christie's later works feel like they are echoing to us through a fog of recollection, feels doubly apt. Now, I'm deliberately not issuing a spoiler warning here. This is the opposite of a spoiler warning. No spoiler warning from me. Chapter 3 of The Driver's Seat plainly and horrifically opens thus. She will be found dead tomorrow morning from multiple stab wounds. It's one of Spark's favourite devices to spoil her own stories. It's in Prime 2, we are told that Miss Brodie will be betrayed by one of her favourite pupils by page 30. We are also told that Joyce Emily had run away to Spain and been killed in an accident, and about Mary McGregor's horrific death by fire in almost the same breath as we're introduced to her. Similarly, the deaths in Not to Disturb, says Bold, are preordained, so there is no element of suspense. One might think that the key component of a mystery novel is to keep the mystery, or that any story must gradually release information to create suspense and keep the action propulsive. If this is the metric, then Spark's novels uniformly fail, but they do so deliberately. I want to be clear that this device that Spark uses is categorically not foreshadowing, the act of hinting at possible conclusions. For which most authors, including Christie, is their bread and butter. Take this example of foreshadowing from Christie's Cat Among the Pigeons. I think Julia said that we should probably have a second murder soon. There is then a second murder, by the way. But this is far too non-committal for Spark's bold tastes. She doesn't want musings, she wants facts. Spark herself elaborated on the method to her madness on a Sunday feature. She said, quote, it struck me that suspense is not necessarily keeping people hanging on to the last page to know what happened. People are even more interested if they know that X is going to die before the last page, but they still want to read on to know how. And if you do more or less know the end of the story, it still keeps people riveted even more. It may surprise you then to say that this is a trick that Christie invokes too. It's a literary device, but it's essentially her classic crime fiction double bluff. Books like Lord Edgware Dies, Towards Zero, plays like Witness for the Prosecution, they all go to great lengths to frame the most obvious suspect early on, making the suspense of the story essentially whodunit, before Christie, with what we could call Sparkian mercurial spirit, comes forth at the end and goes, no, that wasn't the full story, or yes, it was them after all, but there's a catch. This is too easy, Poirot exclaims doubtfully in Lord Edgware Dies. In The ABC Murders, an excellent Christie novel, the way Alexander Bonaparte Cust, who we are led to believe is the murderer, crowbars into the narrative and buckles the story early with his confession, reminds one of James Bailey's quote about the driver's seat being the, quote, efforts of a fictional character to overthrow her author and thus assume an unwarranted level of authorial power. It's this exact manipulation of readers like us who are genre savvy that Spark loves. Alan Perrow said of Memento Mori, disciplined by the tropes that govern the mystery novel, we read paranoically, hectically searching for conspiracy and confirmation at every turn. So, although I have shown, as I have shown, Spark borrows extensively from the murder mystery, it's significant that murder is seldom the central crime of a Spark novel. It's as if death would be too cut and dry, as she opts instead for for similar symbols of transgression, like blackmail and more abstract betrayals. The crime genre simply has too many rules for Spark, this queen of contrary and experimentation. But that's not to say that the queen of crime, Agatha Christie, who codified most of those rules to begin with, wasn't contrary and experimental too. Bailey says Spark's fiction occupies a vexed position in relation to the existing critical discourse on experimental writing, citing her conspicuous absence from the Routledge Companion to Experimental Literature. If that book can't see its way to citing Spark, I highly doubt it gets around to citing Christie. I can't even begin to list the amount of 20th century literature accounts that neglect to cite Christie. So, moving on to our second case study. Whilst Cat Among the Pigeons is putting the cat among the pigeons with its foreshadowings, Spark refuses to let her cats out of the bag. I think that might have been the pun that Sam was warning you about. And now we turn to the fascinating cross-pollination between Christie's school set mystery, Cat Among the Pigeons, and the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Cat Among was published in 1959 and is a Poirot murder mystery. If you haven't read it, it's set in the fictional Meadowbank School for Girls, and it involves a jewel heist, a mysterious tennis racket, and the murder of a games mistress. It's fab. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is categorically the best novel ever written, and I will fight anyone that says otherwise. And it was published in 1961, and it's a novel set in the 1930s in the fictional Marcia Blame School for Girls, based partly on Spark's own school days. It is centered on the titular inspirational teacher who takes a group of her favorite pupils under her wing, but as they mature and they grow, they realize what their childhood hero really stands for. Obviously, neither of these writers can claim to have invented the school novel, but the thing is, neither of these novels are straightforward school set novels. In fact, both writers have a lot of fun placing incongruities within the school setting, a thriller plot muscling its way into Meadowbank, and the incongruity of a fascist in a Scottish girls' school. Secret agents, robbery, violence, murder, all preposterous, but that side of life exists, Adam tells us in Cat Among. Twists such as Christie including a gardener who is secretly a secret agent, and those twists are certainly not beyond the pale for Spark. And the wider context of the revolution that we see in Cat Among the Pigeons contrasts with the Spanish Civil War backdrop of Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Both novels spend some time foregrounding the charming naivety of the students, discussing the adult world that seems to swirl above their heads, only half of which they understand, as they're kind of sexualized beyond their years. Both Miss Brodie and Miss Bulstrode are placed beyond the narrative. Interestingly, Bulstrode is even explicitly considered above suspicion in the whodunit plot, which is a rare accolade in a Christie novel. That's a point made by the All About Agatha podcast again. Thanks to the headmistress, the great Miss Bulstrode, Meadowbank is described as unconventional but successful. She says, the school, quote, is a creation, if I may say it, of one woman, myself. And what then follows is exactly the sort of rousing and very vain speech that Miss Brodie makes in her book. Bulstrode is, quote, full of cosmopolitan aplomb, whilst Brodie is Bulstrode is full of cosmopolitan aplomb. It's a point as to how similar they are, whilst Brodie is memorably called an Edinburgh festival all of her own. The key difference, though, is that Meadowbank is run by the Maverick, whereas at Marcia Blame, the Maverick Brodie very much stands on the outer edge. Miss Bulstrode was someone, Christie writes with a capital S to the someone, sounding uncannily similar to the epithets we continually hear in Prime. For example, Rose Stanley was famous for sex. Both texts then have these powerful female characters at the heart of their stories. And both writers are, of course, famous for their, quote, spinsters I mentioned earlier, Miss Marple and Miss Brodie, who both, to some extent, have been mixed up with the popular image of their creators, again, reductively, I think. But if you take away anything, take away this. Two things are undeniable. We know Spark read Christie, and Prime and Cat bear many striking similarities just 2 years apart. I think it's clear that this girls' school set mystery packed with intrigue must have been in the back of Spark's mind when she came to write her Prime. To conclude then, by contrasting Christie to a luminary of the literary world, albeit one that's sometimes neglected, we can better appreciate Christie's sophistication and skill, and the more insidious ways in which she too challenges the status quo. By positioning Spark within genre traditions, the shackles of which she's trying to cast off, we have thrown into clearer focus her radicalism and depth. We can resultantly view her much less as a lone ranger or a maverick like Brodie, or more deserving, and instead more deserving of broader attention. I hope this study can act as a foundation on which to build more work that uses connections between these two authors to elevate and illuminate new aspects of their writing and encourage Spark to be more widely read. While Christie has stayed remarkably consistently at the forefront of the cultural and adaptational landscape since she first rose to fame, Spark's trajectory, as we've said, is, in my opinion, wholly sadder and more unjust. She gained a certain level of notoriety from Brodie, but this light has undeniably dimmed since. Efforts were made in 2018, the Spark Centenary, to put her back on the map, pun thoroughly intended. That's your second of two puns. I'm very sorry. One of the centerpieces of the celebrations of the Spark Centenary was a new play adaptation of the Prime and Miss Jean Brodie. Remember, Christie saw the 66 version. And this one was at the Donmar in Seven Dials. While 2 streets away, the face of Agatha Christie, set in bronze, looked on, I like to think, admiringly. Christie and Spark, spiritually less than half a mile away, artistically divergent, but also in harmony. Thank you.